to welcome you all. Got it? Okay. I'd like to welcome you all. My name is Jane Susswine. I'm president of the Mordecai Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood, and thrilled to be introducing this webinar, Beneath the Surface, Kaplan's Philosophical Commitments Explored. Mel Skult will introduce our wonderful speakers. I just want to say that we are dedicating this webinar to our beloved Leah Kamionkowski, who passed away this month. She was a devoted Reconstructionist, a longtime member of Kol Halev in Cleveland, and a dedicated scholar in her own right. So this is in memory of Leah and in honor of her scholarship. Mel, would you please introduce our wonderful speakers?
Not quite yet, Jane. We're going to give Mel full stage. I have a couple technical announcements that will help the webinar go more smoothly. And one is to remind people that the Kaplan Center is trans-denominational. So if you have a connection to the Jewish people or the story of Judaism, you've landed in the right place. That's all we need to know. So thank you for being with us. We're recording this, so be aware that's being recorded so we can share it with others who are not here, as we often do. We ask you to remain muted. I will mute as soon as I'm done. And to put your questions in the chat room, if possible. I'll be scanning those when we have a break to share them back with our presenters. And if you're not comfortable with the chat room, Sheridan, our Zoom Gabbai and administrator for the Kaplan Center, will drop Jeffrey at kaplancenter.org into the chat room, and you're welcome to send your questions to me there. I just want to announce one thing about the timing of today. As we sometimes observe, it's hard to dance at two weddings at the same time. And the Jewish calendar is full of many, many things, some of which conflict in terms of time. So we were not able to avoid a conflict with the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, which is having its business meeting today. There are several people on our webinar that can't make the business meeting, and there are a number of people from the business meeting that want to be part of the webinar, and I've arranged to send them the recording for sure. So that's the bad news. That's the way life is. I want to share with you the good news, and the good news means being aware that Mishen Nichnas Adar Marbin Basimcha. When you enter the month of Adar, as we did a few days ago, you're supposed to be lighthearted and full of humor and appreciation for the miraculous. So even though we have a small conflict in terms of people competing for this time frame, I was absolutely shocked on Friday afternoon, late afternoon, right before Shabbat, that up to my apartment complex came a carriage and a horse and a soldier with a pointed helmet on, looked like a Persian soldier. And the soldier gave me this scroll and asked me to share this scroll with you. So I'm opening the scroll, and it reads, whereas the Kaplan Center for Jewish Peoplehood and the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association are having important learning and business events scheduled for Super Bowl Sunday, and whereas the National Football League recognizes in principle the importance of its fans in North America and across the world living creatively in two civilizations, I am pleased to inform you that the National Football League has temporarily suspended today's Super Bowl and is searching for a conflict-free date in the future. Sincerely, Roger Goodell, Commissioner of the National Football League, 45th generation descendant of King Ahasuerus of Persia. So with that little bit of levity, I see at least a few people laugh, put to the side, and the guidelines gone over. It is my pleasure to turn to Dr. Mel Skull, the Vice President and Academic Advisor for the Kaplan Center, to talk about the purpose of the webinar and introduce our guests. So Mel, it is all yours.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff. As many of you know, I have been involved in the discovery of valuable gems having to do with Kaplan for many, many years. And most times that has been in terms of texts, but sometimes it has to do with people. And two of the people that I like to think of as I've discovered are with us today, Nadav Berman and Vered Sakal. I've known Nadav for a very long time. We go back about 20 years. I'd like to think I was instrumental in starting him on Kaplan. I've known Sakal for a shorter time, and it has been very, very exciting to meet and talk with both of these scholars. So let me say a word about each of them and what they're going to say. And I'll start with Nadav. Nadav Schiffman Berman, doctor, is completing a postdoctoral fellowship at Ben Gurion University at the present moment. And prior to that, Nadav was a postdoctoral associate fellow at Yale University's Jewish Studies program. He also was an adjunct at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And he is currently a research fellow on the Faculty of Law at the University of Haifa. And what will be of very interest to you, and especially to Jeff, working on the matter of law and Jewish thought and technology. And with all that, Nadav has spent much time thinking and writing and speaking about Mordecai Kaplan. And he is going to speak to us today about the philosophical foundations of Kaplan's thought. And that, of course, means pragmatism when we talk to Nadav, and particularly Kaplan's approach to Zionism, which is so timely at the moment. Dr. Rabbi Vered Sakal is professor of Jewish studies at Christopher Newport University. She was a visiting professor at Indiana University in Bloomington. She holds a PhD in Jewish thought from the Hebrew University, and she is also taught at NYU and at the University of Pennsylvania. I want to say a very long time ago, I gave a speech at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and in the question period, Neil Gilman, Zichrono Livracha, stood up and asked me and said, "Is Kaplan a naturalist?" Well, well, theologically a naturalist. Well, I wish I had had Vered Sakal at my side to deal with that question, because that question is central to her presentation today about Kaplan's theology and the work of Jon Hick and his concept of realism, which I think is enormously enlightening. About her work is enormously enlightening about a very complex and difficult subject. So now I turn the program over to Dr. Vered Sakal.
Thank you, Mel. Thank you so much for the kind introduction, and thank you, Jeffrey and the Kaplan Center, for having me. I'm very excited to share knowledge and conversations with colleagues and friends. I would like also to start with, we say, "Mishnechnas Adar marbim b'simcha," but this year it's harder to be happy when we think about the hostages kept in Gaza. And I want to acknowledge this situation and say that this year it's with a heavy heart that I enter Adar Aleph and Adar Bet. And with this, let me start sharing my presentation. And me just make sure I can share the whole screen. Okay, there we go. So I would like to start by dedicating my talk to Rabbi Professor David Ellinson. He was the rabbi who ordained me more than 20 years ago, and I found this picture doing a Passover cleaning, I think 6 or 7 years ago. And then I wrote him telling him that he must have hundreds of ordination pictures with rabbis all over the world, but I wonder how many of them are less than 2 years old. So this is my daughter rushing into the stage, and he was so, as usual, you know, bigger than life. He was a big man, you can see, and he had a big heart. And while she rushed into the stage, as I was being ordained, and some people went, you know, shh, and how could it be? He just opened his arms towards her and gave her a hug. And this was a very important moment, a very teaching moment for me. What does it mean to be a rabbi? Not only a great scholar like Professor Ellinson was, but also a mensch, a big man. Not only a physically big man, but also a person that had a huge heart. So I want to dedicate this talk in his honor and his memory. And moving on, before we started Zoom, I remember one of you coming into the line of squares saying that paper had a lot of terminology in it that might seem intimidating. So one of my goals is actually every time we come together, we try to enrich each other with ideas and knowledge. So hopefully by the time I'm done and this first stage of conversation is over, our terminology will be richer, and words that might seem unfriendly to begin with will actually turn out to be great theoretical tools which can help us not only understand Kaplan better, but understand our religious journeys, our explorations, and so on. So this talk will survey Kaplan's ideas about God and salvation in light of current debates about religious realism and pluralism. Now, I want to start off with a statement. Kaplan was not a philosopher. He was a visionary, he was a scholar, he was a prolific writer, among many other things, but he was not a philosopher in the sense of a writer who produces systematically arranged theories and ideas. His great intellectual intuition can be felt throughout his vast body of work, but his writing often lacks a methodological aspect. But in this talk, I will try to philosophize Kaplan. I will be doing so by using definitions from Jon Hick, one of the prominent voices in religious philosophy in the 20th century. My central argument in this presentation will be that Kaplan was a religious realist who affirmed the ontological existence of God, even though his epistemology dedicate the use of non-realistic and functionalistic religious language. I will soon break those words into smaller pieces and they will be useful to all of us. So what might sound clear now will be explained shortly. Terms that are foreign will become helpful and enriching, allowing us as a studying community to expand our knowledge on Kaplan's work and legacy. The talk will survey Kaplan's ideas about God and salvation in light of current debates on religious realism and pluralism. Using definitions from Jon Hick's work, one of the prominent scholars of 20th century, our central argument is that Kaplan was a religious realist who affirmed the ontological existence of God. Now let's break down these big words and terms into smaller pieces. So in order to do so, we will use philosophical structures borrowed actually from Jon Hick, whose work on philosophical theology and religious pluralism is considered by many as central for 20th century religious scholarship. Our purpose is not to give a full survey of Hick's work or to compare between Hick and Kaplan, but to utilize Hick's methodological discussions as theoretical structures through which we can speculate what a more constructed Kaplan would say on this topic. And I will start with a very short introduction of Hick's work that will explain how and why I use it in order to study Kaplan. So this is the first quote taken from Hick, in which he says the debate between realist and non-realist understandings of religious language exposes the most fundamental of all issues in the philosophy of religion today. So Hick draws our attention to a fascinating aspect of religious discourse, which is the shift between approaches that affirm the existence of a divinity, which exists independently of human perception of it, and approaches that negate the ontological existence of a divine entity. Now, what do we do with this definition? Let me give you a rule of thumb, which I always give my students, and it's very helpful. So how do you know if something is ontologically existing? The basic test is, if everybody were to die tonight, would X continue to exist? And when I talk to this with my students, I always tell them, think of money. So money exists epistemologically. It's a product of human conscience. But if we were all to die, everything that would be left would be paper or pieces of metal, not money. So money does not ontologically exist. It exists only as an epistemological structure. Still, the fact that it does not have ontological existence does not mean that it's not important, that it does not have a huge effect on human life. It does. So in this sense, we can call it real, even if it does not ontologically exist. So when we look at the terminology, and hopefully I was able to break down these words into more useful concept, we can say that ontological existence means that X will exist if all humans were to die. Epistemological existence means that X is a product of the human mind. A knee-jerk reaction will lead us to claim that epistemological existence is not real. But as many scholars have shown, if X is a product of the human mind, it does not mean that X is not real or that it does not have a real effect on human lives. So an epistemological object could be the projection of the human mind, but still be real to us in many ways. And if you know Berger's work, also the Sacred Canopy and so on, this is relevant to understanding Berger as well. So in a religious context, which is the context of our discussion, in a religious context, we can say that religious non-realism, and I hope this sets of words is becoming more and more understandable as we use them. So religious non-realism recognizes the importance of the divine, the ultimate, God, or real to human life, even though it denies its ontological existence. So God does not ontologically exist when you are a non-realist. Consequently, while the realist sees religion as a reaction to an ontologically existing reality, the non-realist sees religion as a set of beliefs and activities that are designed to produce a structure of meaning for human life. So, since we are all Kaplan scholars, I think the question of anybody who read Kaplan for a while is Mordecai Kaplan a version of Judaism, of religious realism or non-realism? Kaplan, the founding father of Reconstructionist Judaism and one of the leading Jewish thinkers of 20th century, based his project for the reconstruction of Judaism on the rejection of the supernatural and the idea, rejecting the idea of a transcendent God. A pragmatist, following James and Dewey empirical and naturalistic orientations, Kaplan was more often concerned with how believing in God functions, rather than the concept of God or the question of God's ontological existence. Consequently, many of Kaplan readers and scholars see his pragmatic religion project as a non-realistic project. My claim here today is that when read through Hickian terminology, a unique version of a realistic religiosity can be found in Kaplan's work. A religiosity that is anchored not in a mind-independent God that exists, as Hick puts it, even if there were no human brains. Now, this is a claim that is not immediate to most Kaplan readers, because in many places in his work, they do suggest a non-realistic God in many places. And let me show you just one example. So this is taken from questions Jews asked that was published in 1957. And here Kaplan says, truth, justice, love are conceived as operating in their own right and helping to bring order out of chaos. But the same token, we must accept as genuine the experience of Godhood, which is to the environment or cosmos what selfhood or personality is to the body. So we can see how using a language like experience of Godhood can be understood as non-realistic, as paying more attention to the experience of the human rather than the existence or the essence of the entity. And it does align with the major scheme of Kaplan's work. One of the main characteristics of Kaplan's ambitious enterprise to reconstruct Judaism is his effort to adjust it to what he believed to be modern values: rational scientific thinking, humanism, and naturalism. Throughout his extensive body of work, Kaplan strived to apply new meaning to central Jewish concepts: God, salvation, Israel, by negating their supernaturalistic nature. This naturally led to the conclusion by many that Kaplan is a non-realistic. However, when we look at his entire body of work, which spans over more than 7 decades, we can find the possibility for a realistic reading of Kaplan. And I'll show you just a few examples. So here, this is taken from When is Religion Authentic? It's from the Reconstructionist Journal. It's from 1964. And we notice a timeline with, I think it's important to notice because I think Kaplan was reacting to the criticism of many readers who claim that his God is not a realistic God, a God that exists outside the human brain. So here he says, God ontologically is therefore that aspect of the cosmos which functions as a unified field of relationships. Informed by the terminology, which I hope is now more user-friendly, that we borrowed from Hick and his approach to divinity, we can already say a few things about this text from 1964, and through it about Kaplan's cosmology and theology. For example, here in this quote, we find that Kaplan is very careful not to reduce all manifestation of God into human projections, as he clearly and directly describes God as ontologically existing. And so we can say that Kaplan's cosmology attempted to, while his cosmology attempted to discard supernaturalism, by creating a universe in which men and God exist, he does make sure we understand that he does think that God exists ontologically. So Kaplan's God is a power or process in the cosmos that redeems human life by giving them direction for human salvation. And while much has been written about Kaplan's God, we see that Kaplan was well aware of how his God as process concept was received by his many, many critics, who described his work as what he would call non-realistic. And here we see that Kaplan was aware of this criticism and that he addressed this matter directly. I mean, this showed that this was important to him. He attempted to refute non-realistic atheistic accusation, but by demonstrating the kind of existence his God has in his universe. Accordingly, we can claim that Kaplan's choice of word can be understood as an attempt to reject non-realism, to reject an atheistic understanding of his work, as against humanistic interpretation of God as a psychological, social projection, or as an emotional symbol. Kaplan directly affirms the ontological existence of his God. His direct ontological statements suggest the significance he ascribes to a realistic reading of his work. His persistence to refute atheistic interpretation leads us to conclude that even though Kaplan offered his readers a bold concept of a functionalistic godhood, it was extremely important for him to present his work as a realistic project in which God ontologically exists, even if all humans were to die. So this is one thing that we can take from reading Kaplan through Hick. The language, the terms, and also being able to notice the importance, the important part it plays in Kaplan's theology, and how important it was for him to refute the many accusations that he was accused with, saying that his God is not ontologically existing. Following this, let us now examine another aspect of Kaplan's theological worldview by looking at another one of Hick's accounts of religious realism. So, just again, enriching our vocabulary, we have transcendent and supernatural. So transcendent in this discussion, and of course we could talk about it for a much longer time, but here I would like to use the word transcendent as out of this physical world. And transnatural, which is more Kaplanian, in this conversation, I'm using it within the realms of the physical world. There is nothing beyond this world. So, the Kaplanian God is indeed a non-human higher reality in relation to which human salvation is achieved. Hence, we can say that this far, Kaplan's religious project parallels Hick's definitions of religious realism, and that Kaplan can be considered as a religious realist. But even though Kaplanian cosmology does create a religious system that contains an ontologically existing God that has a transformative value, it seems that his religious system differs from Hick's definition on religious religion in one very important aspect. Kaplan's cosmos is not supernaturalistic. It's not transcendent. It does not have anything beyond this cosmos. And for Hick, this is super important because Hick says each of the great religion tradition affirms that in addition to the social and natural world of our ordinary experience, there is a limitlessly greater and higher reality beyond or within us in relation to which or to whom is our highest good. And to give oneself freely and totally to this one is our final salvation, liberation, and so on. Now, according to Hick, only when we accept transcendent understanding of the universe can we allow for the existence of realities that are able to transform human life and lead us to salvation. So according to Hick, if you do not have a transcendent God, you cannot experience salvation because human life, says Hick, men and women, says Hick, cannot reach salvation in the duration of one human life. Except for a few outstanding individuals, most of us require a prolongation that could only be achieved in a supernatural universe that allows for the continuation of spiritual growth beyond the point reached by the time of death. Now, as Kaplan readers, we know that Kaplan could not support any kind of supernatural understanding of the universe or of life after death, and so on. So, we will extract from this text an important aspect that helps us to better understand Kaplan's religious thinking. So according to Hick, a non-supernaturalistic religion cannot offer a real possibility for salvation. According to Hick, if your God is part of your world, the world you are actually offering a pessimistic worldview, one which lacks salvation, for it condemns the majority of human race to remain forever unfulfilled. But when we examine Kaplan's cosmology and salvational theology, we come to realize that his religious project does not follow with Hick's theory of supernaturalism and salvation. In accordance with Kaplan's transnatural cosmology that places everything in the same universe, Kaplan's salvation cannot include supernatural elements such as life after death. But Kaplan is very, very careful to note that his negation of the supernatural does not mean that he annuls the existence of a transformative God. Hence, Kaplan realistic religion, contrary to Hick, requires the Jews to live and redeem their lives in this world in one of a lifetime personal and social salvation. So Kaplan was well aware of the fact that the attainment of such salvation is not of today or tomorrow. Still, he asserts, men and women should not feel overwhelmed or impotent in light of their mortality and the short time they have on this earth to achieve their salvation. That is because God, which exists, the power that makes for salvation, it is inherent in this world, and that God counteracts this notion of futility and promises the ability to achieve salvation. A salvation that is not a state of physical compensation for human suffering, but a human aspiration towards maximum fulfillment. So the difference between the two thinkers, if I conclude this part, is therefore quite clear. While Hick connects between salvation and supernaturalism, Kaplan disconnects between the two. And while Hick asserts that in most cases, human salvation can only occur in the afterlife, Kaplan assumes that human fulfillment is in one lifetime in this world possible to achieve project. We can therefore conclude this part of our investigation by saying that Kaplan is realistic and optimistic, who offers his readers a religious system of God, human, world to ensure the possibility of salvation. Moving on, we come to realize that reading Kaplan while utilizing Hickian terminology allows us to deepen our understanding of Kaplan's work. Let's do this one more time, and let's now employ the same method to issues of epistemology and pluralism. Again, epistemology might seem like a big word, but it's the study of the human conscious and study of human knowledge. So if ontological existence is something that exists without the human mind, epistemological existence is something that exists because of the human mind. So we have seen that Kaplan's cosmology describes a universe in which a supernatural higher reality exists independently of human conception of it. The question is then, if Kaplanian cosmology supports the notion of a realistic God, why are there so few direct ontological discussions about this topic in his work? So one possible explanation for Kaplan's tendency to refrain from philosophical and ontological language has already been mentioned. Kaplan's main interest was not metaphysics or theology. He was a pragmatist who strived to save the Jews and to save Judaism. Hence, he was trying to create the tools for the modern Jew who was looking for a way to find God, not to compose a new philosophy, not to alienate someone from the discussion because it's too philosophical. On the contrary, offer a language, offer a vision which can invite more people into the Jewish discussion. Another explanation for why Kaplan is not doing more philosophy is that his mostly non-metaphysical discussion about God can be found in this text, which is taken from The Meaning of God in Modern Jewish Religion. And here he says, we cannot expect to understand the nature of God. Who of us even knows the nature of man, or for that matter, his own nature? But we must be able to state definitely what experiences or phenomena we are prepared to identify as manifestations of God, and why we identify them as such. Kaplan's religious language is often non-ontological or non-philosophical, non-ontological in this case, because this is the only way Kaplan thinks we should speak about God. We might not be able to know God's nature, but we can recognize the effects of divine activity as it is revealed in nature in our life. Such religious language or choice or epistemology resonates, of course, with Maimonides and his attributes of action theory, if you know them. And interestingly, Kaplan connects himself and affirms using Maimonides. And if we know Kaplan, we know that he doesn't always give credit to the scholars that he's using. So interestingly, here he does acknowledge working with the Maimonidean tools of attributes of action instead of talking about the essence of God. So Kaplan linguistics reflect is religious epistemology that claims that we cannot know God, we can only know God's actions in the world. Accepting human inability to directly perceive God, we come to understand that when Kaplan speaks of universal forces that make for human improvement, he is not avoiding a direct ontological reference to God because he thinks that God does not realistically exist. On the contrary, he is speaking about God the best way he can, by recognizing God's correlative relational meaning that concerns human salvation. Hence, we can say that Kaplan's linguistics reflects his religious epistemology. While he rarely discusses the ontological aspects of God and often chooses a functionalist, humanistic, relational language, he does offer his reading a theistic epistemology in which God exists and is very much present in the world and in our lives. Such a religious epistemology that refutes the ability to know God's substantive meaning and focuses on God's attributes and God's manifestations in nature and in human life calls to mind the way Hick utilizes Immanuel Kant's philosophy, which distinguishes between reality as it exists in itself and as it is humanly experienced. Now, we will not delve deeply into this topic, but moving on through it, we will touch on our last point, which is religious pluralism and Kaplan's religious pluralism. So acknowledging the gap between the reality and the way it is sensed and understood by humans opens us to accepting various representations of the unattainable divine reality. So as Hick says, we see the real always and only through the spectacles of our religious categories. And these, as we are actually aware today, vary significantly from one culture to another. Each culture, says Hick, responds differently to the ultimate reality that is beyond conceptualization. Its culture projects its own concept on the indescribable divinity, creating a unique and coherent within itself system of belief. Various religions can be seen as differing apprehensions of the one divinity which cannot be known in itself, but only in and through human encounters with it. As such, they cannot be graded as more or less truthful, for the divine reality cannot be known in itself. Rather, they are accounted as true as they make possible the transformation of human existence. So after reading Hick, we can ask, does Kaplan religiosity support a similar notion of pluralism? And it seems the answer would be positive. And here we have Judaism Without Supernaturalism, another book of Kaplan from 1958, in which he says, the assumption that one's religion is the only true religion is as obsolete as the one's country is the center of the world, or Jerusalem being the center of the universe, according to Nadav. Every religion aspires to be means of salvation to the members of its people or church. No religion can be absolutely more true or less true than the other. Although Kaplan does not develop a theoretical system of religious pluralism, we can see that his religious epistemology lays the ground for a pluralistic worldview that recognizes the inherent value of every religion as a manifestation of God's presence in the world. That is because each religion, culture, civilization manifests a particular understanding of the cosmos and of the universal human longing and need for salvation. As a result, each religion can and should be considered as true, for religious truth is not concerned with ontological or metaphysical claims about the existence of this or that God, but with man's ability to achieve salvation. So, coming close to our end, we conclude this analysis of Kaplan work here. If we are to summarize what a reading of Kaplan through Hickian eyes taught us, we can say, that our investigations of Kaplan's cosmology and epistemology presented us with the strong evidence of his religious realism. I'm hoping now by the end of this talk, our vocabulary is richer. So religious realism of an existing God, and deepened our understanding of the implications of his naturalistic religiosity. We found that Kaplan can be portrayed as a religious realist who assumes that even though God ontologically exists, God cannot be known directly, but only through attributes as they are manifested in the universal and human nature. This Maimonidean epistemology leads to the preference of a religious language that focuses on God's salvational actions in the world, as well as to religious pluralism. For if no man is capable of knowing the mystery of God's essence, no religion can claim to be the only true religion. Each religion is true as long as it aspires to be the means of salvation for its members. Let us conclude this attempt to read Kaplan through Hick by portraying the Kaplanian project via Hickian terminology. Kaplan's religiosity is a realistic, naturalistic, pluralistic, and optimistic salvational religious system, which prefers a non-ontological religious language, not because Kaplan has a self-sufficient humanistic atheist notion of God, but because it is a religious language that can best describe the Kaplanian God. Thus, Kaplan's religion is not a non-realistic project in which God has meaning but no existence. Rather, it is a religious system that points out to the divine reality that everybody can recognize and utilize. For everybody, according to Kaplan, can know God by God's action in nature and within them. Thank you so much.
Nadav, a response.
Yes. Wow. Thank you, Vered. That was really fabulous and so rich. Also, the presentation was very illuminating. So I tend to agree with really most of what you said, Vered. Let me also start by mentioning the yearning for the return of our hostages, now 128 days. The son of our Gabbai in Minyan Akel in Jerusalem is one of them, Hirsch Goldberg Polin. And it's really much more difficult to be happy in this Adar. Hopefully, by the time we reach Adar Bet, the second Adar, we will have the full right to be just fully happy with the return of all of them safely. Unfortunately, we know that some of them are not alive. So, Vered, I don't have a lot of time, but let me say maybe a few comments really in response to what you said. And I tend to agree with much of it. When I think of Kaplan, I often associate him with the classical American pragmatists. Peirce, he was not mentioning so much. Mel once told me that there is a passing comment on Charles Sanders Peirce, but it is mostly William James and John Dewey. And much of what you and James said is echoed by Hick and by others, but of course there is a degree of sophistication that we find in Hick, which is really illuminating. I will concentrate on a few comments about the term philosophy, lexical comments, and about pragmatism. Because it's really a question whether he was a philosopher, capital P philosopher, perhaps small p philosopher, and or a pragmatist, and whether pragmatism is a philosophy. So regarding, and I'll get later also to the concepts of realism and nominalism or mind-dependent existence of the world. But let me start with these two P's, right? Philosophy and pragmatism. And concerning philosophy, it is again a question of how to contextualize Kaplan. I tend to think that he's at least minimally a small p philosopher, meaning he was a thinker, he was a profound thinker. He thought very deeply about matters of the Jewish people, of humanity, and by doing so, he manifested the love of wisdom. It is just a wisdom in service of Tikkun Olam, of healing the world, mending the world, and helping the Jewish people be a better version of themselves, of ourselves, and he believed in God. I totally agree. I would tend to say that he was a philosopher in this broad sense, which is important, and this brings us to pragmatism, because concerning pragmatism, there is also a question whether it is a philosophy at all. And when thinking of Kaplan, we may add again the names of William James, John Dewey, but also think of Hilary Putnam. He was hesitant about self-defining as a pragmatist, but he was, let's say, a small p pragmatist. And there are many others. Time is limited, but many other serious, let's say, philosophers or professional philosophers, or philosophers of the kind that write treatises, right? Nicholas Rescher. He's an important philosopher, a leading, I would say, pragmatist, and a realist, and therefore I'm inclining to say that Kaplan was a philosopher in this broad sense of seeing pragmatism as a legal and a legitimate philosophy, which is committed to questions of function and effect, and without abandoning the entire metaphysical arena of ideas, of coherence, of religious theism that you described beautifully. So that's about philosophy and pragmatism. And again, there is a huge question whether pragmatism deserves the name philosophy. For those who deny that, Kaplan is not a philosopher by any means. But we should also recall that by the time that Kaplan wrote, at least his early works, he lived for a long time, think of Durkheim. Durkheim was one of his books, I think it posthumously published, Pragmatism and Sociology. So in the beginning of the 20th century, the connection between the disciplines, I think, was viewed quite differently from today's highly professionalized philosophy. And often within analytic philosophy, the fences are higher. But you find, again, think of the example of Hilary Putnam, that when there is a certain degree of greatness in philosophy, you find that there are serious philosophers that are, self-defined as pragmatists. So we should think of the professionalization of the disciplines in this regard. And Kaplan was in this sense a thinker of the Renaissance, not yet accepting the high fences between the disciplines. And today many of us tend to think of philosophy and of the humanities as more intertwined and interdisciplinary. So this is one thought about philosophy and pragmatism. Another thought is about realism and nominalism. Again, realism is the idea that, for example, God or entities in general exist regardless of our construction and thinking and pondering of them. And nominalism is the idea that we find, by the way, very much in James's late philosophy, that the world is really barash שלנו, as we say in Hebrew, in our mind. And there is a great degree of flexibility about really building and constructing the world. And as in the title of Reconstructionist Judaism and Reconstructing Judaism, the new title also about Judaism. And here we, I think, have to take in consideration that there are different entities in Kaplan's world. God, I think, is a very, very stable anchor. I tend to agree with Meir and with Meir Ben Chorin about Kaplan's transnaturalism, which means that it's not a thin naturalism or narrow naturalism. The world is not enough, in the as the phrase says. And he believed truly, as a person of Musar, Torah Musar, his youth education perhaps, in God as a personal entity, and in this regard he was a fanatical thinker, but you may call it a moderate foundationalist, because he thought that it's important to ask questions about God. He has an article about skepticism in the early days of the Second Temple. He was not a dogmatist. Now, about other entities, and take Torah, for example, he was very much a nominalist. He thought that we have a responsibility to reconstruct Judaism and to really consider and reconsider the way that our performance of the mitzvot, of the Torah, as it expands into including our democratic ethos, and how it affects our life. No written letter by its own right can be thought of without considering the effects. And as you said, he was a functionalist in this regard. And here again, for example, we have a division, because about mitzvot ben adam lechavero, duties between a person and his fellow person, Kaplan was very, very strict. Again, maybe it's his musar. He was very, very serious about our moral duties. On the other hand, he thought, and it's an interesting question whether it's a sustainable assertion, that mitzvot ben adam lamakom, between a person, man, woman, and God, can be understood and interrupted more freely under the category of folkways, right? That is, writing about in Judaism as a civilization. Now, it is a huge question whether this division, which is really anchored in Chazal, right? It's a rabbinic innovation, this very division of moral laws and vertical believing rituals. But let's put aside this question. Kaplan was, I want to suggest, very realist about our moral duties at a social level, and very much a nominalist as it comes to the issues of the so-called ritual laws or mitzvot sheben adam lamakom. Think of Sukkah, of commuting to synagogue on Shabbat. And there are interesting issues in his diary about his own really vicissitudes of belief around, for example, smoking and on Shabbat, and how his children reacted to that. And he was a real, I would say, Soloveitchikian believer, life of faith in the deepest sense. But I again want to return to the lower resolution and to say that he was a realist and a nominalist at the same time, and perhaps not only regarding different objects, either God or Torah, but perhaps also about the same object of human knowledge. So also about God. If the meaning of God, I have here the Hebrew. Can you see it? It's blur. The Hebrew version of too much blur. Can you see the ערכי היהדות והתחדשותם, or the English version? So God is also conceived in different ways, because this raw fact that you said, the mere existence of Ein, right, of the unattainable God, is a solid object of knowledge. But the way God is perceived, for example, in this book about the meaning of God in modern religion, God is actually conceived differently within each and every festival, holiday, because different nuances are coming to mind that are instructed or inspired by the Torah and by the unfolding commentaries of the oral law, etc. So, and this is perhaps connecting, and here I reach the right, Jeff, I have to finish soon. 5 minutes, okay. And here there is a connection to the pluralism aspect, which is true to Kaplan. In some sense, he was less pluralistic than we think of pluralism today, meaning he was a bit stubborn about several issues. He was a modernist, and modernism is often more tough-minded in William James's categories, and yet he was tender-minded and flexible about, I would say, many things, or maybe even most things. He was not dogmatic, and pluralism here, it's interesting to think about it through the comment that you made about Jerusalem, right? Because before we started, I want to see the faces of the people here. Say, okay, that I'm speaking from Jerusalem. So I was saying before the kind of jokes that Jerusalem is the center of the world, because there's this notion in the Medba map, right? But think of this example, right? Jerusalem can be seen in this sense as a parochial concept of the Jewish people, but recall that Jerusalem is sacred to Christianity, to Islam, and when saying that Jerusalem, for example, is the center of the world, which I didn't mean so seriously. I like the city, I live here, but it's a complicated city. When saying that Jerusalem is sacred, this is not yet saying that it is not sacred to some religions and traditions, which, as we know, is a source of many tensions and complications, and even wars, right? Israel is a promised land. It is promised to many nations. Now, how to argue and how to resolve these tensions is an interesting question that we'll perhaps get into in the second part. But as for now, I want to say that the fact that for example, Kaplan would say something or assert something about Judaism, about the world, could be often seen in a more nuanced way as a pluralistic assertion. And we should also recall that pluralism is a complicated concept, just like pragmatism, right? There is a critique of pragmatism as being, for example, too instrumentalist. And Horkheimer famously accused Dewey in quite a horrific manner as being a kind of or associated with even Nazism. And obviously, every idea is open to manipulation and to extremism of various sorts. And pluralism too is an interesting concept in this regard, because we now live in a different age or postmodern period. There are many, discourses about the post 9/11 or the post October 7th, and it seems also in thinking about the crisis of shared democratic deliberation vis-a-vis the social platforms, social media, that there is a need for some kind of agreement about reality in order to even engine the melioristic discussion about approaching the world, about solving problems together. And pluralism in this sense is constructive when we are able to agree about basic facts. And the present crisis that Kaplan was not yet, I would say, aware of. It was in the early days of the TV that he passed away, or late days of the TV, but before the smartphones. That for Kaplan, the idea that we share the same reality was a commonplace. And then you can be very pluralistic about the approaches, about how to handle difference, how to celebrate diversity. And
Nadav, if I could join in the conversation for just a moment. First of all, thank you, and thank you to Vered. But in our pre-meeting, we did talk about the fact that the Kaplan Center has been investing in response to what's been happening in Israel and to creatively engaging with what a Kaplanian Zionism looked like to Kaplan in his volume, The New Zionism. And you've done nothing but underscore the reality that to the extent that you have a pragmatic philosophy, you're always doing experiments to make sure that real life can embody the principles that you have. So here on our webinar, we have, I think, Rabbi Dennis Sasso is with us, and he was a participant in our webinar on a new Zionism. And Nadav has been a respondent in our Talmud pages about what that might look like today. So I wanted to, and I now will turn it back to Nadav, encourage Nadav and Vered to think about what it is about Kaplan's underlying philosophy that translates into an approach to Israel and to Zionism in the world that is vital and important in 2024 today. So Nadav, I think you were going to start off with that. Nadav and Vered was going to respond, and we'll take some other responses to the from Mel and others. But first, I want to have a brief opportunity for Nadav and Vered to talk about, given Kaplan's pragmatism, what kind of Zionism comes from the fertile ground of those philosophical commitments?
Vered, or shall I?
Nadav, this is actually your topic, so why don't you start with the presentation, and I'll be happy to respond.
Yes. So thanks, Jeff. I would say the following thing. Pragmatism seems to me like a search, or often searching for middle ground between realism and nominalism, a dialectical search, and the model can be or should be dialectical, and often deploy one aspect, nominalism or realism, according to what benefits the world, society, and so on. In the same token, I would say that for Kaplan, the relationship between universalism and particularism, the Jewish peoplehood, is also a kind of equilibrium, that there is no point in giving up universalism for particularism. Like Buber, Kaplan thought that it would lead to just blind and nationalistic existence, or brutal perhaps. But there is also, for Kaplan, no point or no need to abandon particularism for universalism, because he lived long enough to see the two world wars and the European inability, as I think he thought, inability to reach a model in which every nation and every nation's existence and claims are actually living peacefully with other claims. And Kaplan was a universalist in some sense, important sense, like various other early Zionists, and he was inspired by Echad Ha'am, this task of light to the nations, and Kaplan's Zionism, I believe, was, as you say, Jeff, pragmatist in the sense of, once you acknowledged the need to balance between particularism and universalism, and that the Jews have a right for existence, which is today not a trivial assertion. Once you take it for granted or agree that the Jews have a right to exist and to flourish, and the test for Zionism, according to Kaplan, and I prepared a source sheet, but I don't know if there's I can share it, and maybe I don't know if we have enough time now to read. Do we, Jeff?
A few minutes, yeah.
Yeah. So the cash value, right? It's a term by William James in his book Pragmatism, that truth is examined. That was James's term, in real life. So he was suggesting, James, that we are examining metaphysical assertions by their fruits, right? That's a very important pragmatist theme, which comes from actually from the New Testament. By their fruits you know them, that some vague metaphysical issues should be examined by their earthly consequences. And this idea actually has sources in the Tanakh, in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, and the idea of fruitability, or fruit making, fruit bearing. And Kaplan writes, let's read it. In his Judaism as a Civilization, you can see in text 2.1, from the standpoint of the religious cultural program, whatever helps to produce creative social interaction among Jews rightly belongs to the category of Jewish religion, because it contributes to the salvation of the Jew. Hence, a movement like spiritual Zionism, we call Echad Ha'am, the purpose of which is to keep the Jews of the world united and creative, is entitled to a place in the Jewish religion. Spiritual Zionism, Tzionut Ruchanit in Hebrew, cannot content itself merely within the rebuilding of Palestine. If the Jews throughout the world are to be united and creative, they must not only have a spiritual center in Palestine, what we'd call today Israel, wherever they live in considerable numbers, not only in the US, of course, must organize themselves into vigorous communities. And Kaplan was a communitarian in this regard. The associated life of the Jewish community should not be regarded as extraneous to the Jewish religion. It is a very substance out of which the Jew must strive to evolve religious values. So according to Kaplan, we have several concepts here which are really central. Creativity was for Kaplan, I can't exaggerate in the significance of creativity, and creativity is our way of imitating God. That's the imitatio Dei of the Jewish people, because Kaplan was well aware, perhaps considering Freud's article, Culture and its discontents, that human species, human beings, are having not only the urge for cosmos, for creation, but also for chaos. And this, Freud wrote it vis-a-vis the world wars, and seeing European civilization just eradicating each other's existence instead of doing what the European Union does today, would say. Kaplan was concerned, I think, similarly, and he thought that unless we are dealing creatively with the challenges, when keeping the eye on the need for communities, right? If each and every Jew conducts the life as an island, to paraphrase Heschel, no Jewish civilization can thrive. There needs to be some language. Returning to your insistence on language for Kaplan, there needs to be some shared language, and in order to create a creative, or I'm hesitating to say establish, but to create a creative Jewish life. And the sense of tradition is what connects us to the past. Again, there needs to be some continuity, and Kaplan, even when thinking about the folkways, was attentive to that, and he thought that, and I'll end by saying that in the Zionist context, he thought, I'll read from the Hebrew version of Lechidush Pnei HaTzionut, a new Zionism, 1955 book. He writes, Kaplan, that אין הציונות שואפת לבנות את ארץ ישראל דווקא מחורבנה של הגולה. The land of Israel, the state of Israel should not be built on the ruins of exile, of exilic and diaspora Jewish communities. אדרבה, ארץ ישראל והגולה זקוקות זו לזו. Israel, the Israeli Jewish civilization, and he wrote Gola. He would, I think, modify it to Tfutza, this dispute over the term Gola, which has a negative resonance. בלי הכיף של הגולה, without the diaspora, ארץ ישראל תהפך לפרובינציה, will just be a province of nowhere. And without the center in Eretz Israel, עלולה הגולה להתנוון. So diaspora Judaism needs the center in Israel, but unless the center, the Jewish center in the state of Israel recalls the commitment to the Jewish people, what I'd call synagogue Judaism, which is a phenomenological description of what binds conservative, reconstructing Judaism, Reform, Orthodox, all together. They're all branches of synagogue Judaism, and the danger of a Canaanite Zionism, right? Soil and blood type of Zionism that ignores the normativities of the legal flexibility of synagogue Judaism and diaspora, is in danger of becoming, and here I return to the concept of realism, in danger of becoming an idolatrous realism, because realism, when pushed to the edge without legal flexibility, and flexibility in general is in danger of just idolizing, worshiping the leader, the soil, without being attentive to the other commitments and the higher commitments that binds us as human beings and as Jews.
Nadav, thank you so much. Quite profound. And I know we started with Vered's profundity, and now we brought you into the mix. I want to give Vered a chance to respond, and I know Mel would like to offer a few thoughts as well. And then I think we'll open it up to others as well. Vered?
Thank you, Jeffrey and Nadav. I think I'll piggyback on Nadav's last comment to start with about flexibility and ask Jeffrey. I think we're kind of running out of time. Maybe
we're
I need to
okay.
shorten and just open the floor, because I think wonderful discussions are waiting to happen. So I'll just add a few comments. Thank you, Nadav. This is fascinating, and I'll just reflect on a few of the things that you said. I agree with most of them. So let me just maybe re-echo them in the sense of seeking the balance between universalism and particularism is one of the hardest questions, and I think Kaplan deals with this question in the very topics that he tries to cover throughout his body of work. And the land of Israel and Zionism in particular is one of those questions. And I also thought about another balance between what you were ending with as turning something into a realist entity that might even be worshipped instead of studied. And I thought about one of Kaplan's legacies is the ownership and agency that Jews must feel, not only as customers or individuals who belong to a larger community, but the responsibility to be knowledgeable and then to be a part of the discussion, not only as a listener, but also as someone who has a mind, who has an idea, who contributes. And then the ongoing changes, which are almost as kind of a mitzvah in the sense of decide what you keep constant and what you keep changing, and whatever it is you want to do as tzionut ruchanit, as the spiritual side of Zionism or Judaism on the larger scale, is something all the time you have to be exploring. What does it mean to you today? And I think this is one of Kaplan's biggest legacies, in the sense that maybe not all his ideas translate well into the 21st century, even though more of them do, and this shows the success. But it is, I think, his biggest achievement is to showing us the courage it takes to reinterpret and to reconstruct, and that you must do that if you want to continue to be a relevant Jew in Israel or in the diaspora, and then to explore the both sides. And I think in many ways it has been neglected, the reinterpretation of what does it mean to have a state, to have a homeland, to have sovereignty, to have responsibility over other Jews and other people living in the same area, and so on. And it makes me look, I actually looked at the people who are in this conversation, and sadly, I know this, Nadav, you and myself are the only Israelis here. And that's something we should notice and not only lament, but also think, how do we expand the conversation in a way I think Kaplan would have appreciated, in the sense of a bigger Judaism, that Zionism is part of it, but does not cover all of it. And how do we translate it to living connections between different kinds of Jews, even though they might be looking for different answers for different questions, but the fact that this discussion is not bigger in this sense. And when looking at the two Judaisms, the American, because we have mostly American people here and not European, as far as I could see from the names, is how do the different centers continue on reinterpreting and asking themselves, am I doing the right version of Judaism, Zionism for this century, for this place? And I think many times this discussion is neglected. And as an Israeli, I'll point the finger, at us, saying, at least in Israel, this is not a discussion that is happening enough. And I see it happening more in the States and less in Israel. So in this sense, I feel that a sense of loss, because a lot of what Kaplan could have brought into the Jewish discussion and into the Zionist discussion is not used. And it's not even Kaplan. You've mentioned Echad Ha'am. And today, a lot of Israelis would not be able to say anything about the founding father of, spiritualist Zionism. And we need to ask ourselves, how did this happen? How was this legacy neglected? And what did we lose when we let it slip, outside of common Jewish Zionist Israeli knowledge? So thank you. This actually opens more questions than answers, but I feel like it's time to open the stage for more people to join in the conversation, Jeffrey, if that's okay with you. And that's a conversation I would love to continue, but
yeah,
time.
It is very okay. I did indicate that Mel was the first hand raised, so we'll give Mel a chance to respond, and then we'll encourage people to unmute and come on with questions or raise your hand virtually or in real life and see you in the window, and come forward and share a response or another question for Nadav and Vered. This dialogue could go on for a long, long time because it's quite rich and important, I certainly think. So, Mel, would you like to contribute here?
I'd like to react very specifically. This discussion for me has been very valuable. Vered and Nadav, I very much appreciate what you've been saying. I just want to react to Vered in terms of Kaplan's realism, which is for me so strong and in evidence. And I want to give a very specific instance which poses problems. And that has to do with his discovery of Heschel in 1942 and Heschel's article, An Analysis of Piety. Is there an echo? Yeah. Yeah, somebody needs to. Okay. This. Anyway, the point is that in his response to Heschel, he says piety is an objective spiritual entity. It's a very, very interesting statement. It's in the diary in April 6, 1942. And what it indicates to me is that the substance of the divine, insofar as Kaplan is concerned, is the ideal or the collectivity of the ideals. That's not something that Hick talks about, but Kaplan's connection to the matter of ideals, and one finds it also in Echad Ha'am, by the way, the centrality. And Santayana, in a very, very interesting book about Platonism called Platonism and the Spiritual Life, talks about the fact that the ideals have reality and they also have power, which is so important. And I think the connection between the divine and individuals is in that notion that the ideal can push us, as it were, can motivate us, can lead us into action. So the ideal is real, according to Santayana, and it has power. Well, he's actually talking about Plato, not himself. He was a naturalist. But anyway, thank you very much. Oh.
Thank you, Mel. And I do want to recognize a colleague over on the right of my screen, Rabbi Dennis Sasso, who will be joining the Kaplan Center as a board member. is also going to be celebrating his Yovel, his 50 years in the rabbinate. And he's also been a contributor to the Kaplan Center through our dialogues about Zionism. And I want to invite Dennis or anyone else who would like to comment at this point, elaborate or ask a question, to please do that. Kaplan believed in many things, including dialogue and democracy, and one needs to give people the opportunity to join in dialogue. That's what we're doing right now. So if you would, if there's a comment or a question you have, please, Dennis, it sounds like you might be wanting to do that. So please.
You put me on the spot, but I'm glad to accept. I'm sorry I came in late to the program because I was attending a meeting of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical Association, which hinges on some of the issues that have been discussed here, but that's for another time. Thank you, Vered and Nadav. It occurs to me that another important, I missed much of the early presentation, so I didn't hear the philosophic implications. But I have always felt that in addition to his realism and pragmatism, Kaplan was by nature and in the way that he expressed himself, an optimist. He was an optimist about the human condition. And much of this is expressed not only in his characterization of human nature, but also in his hopes, in his collective hopes for the Jewish people. His last book was called The Religion of Ethical Nationhood. He truly believed in the capacity, not only of the individual, but of the collective, of the nation, to arise to its best self. Different from, for example, Reinhold Niebuhr, who had a rather dismal look about national collective ethics. So I wanted to contribute that. The other thing, I heard some of the discussion of the response that Nadav gave about whether Kaplan is a philosopher or a pragmatist, and is pragmatism philosophic. And this conversation, of course, goes back a long time. Perhaps we can call Kaplan a theologian more so than a philosopher, and because he engaged in matters of Jewish spiritual and existential reality. The things that you have noticed in many ways were anticipated by one of Kaplan's lead disciples, and that was, of course, Milton Steinberg. Milton Steinberg differed with Kaplan, and I have the wonderful book, and this is a topic that we should address in the Kaplan Center. Milton Steinberg's book, Anatomy of Faith. It's a wonderful reflection on the condition of American Jewry and on religious thought. And there he says in a little section on Kaplan that it is Kaplan's dispatch of the metaphysical problem that I have always had my most grievous difficulties with his thought. And then he contributes to elaborate there. And this is where Steinberg and Kaplan differed. They were both staunch Zionists. So I suggest that we dedicate some time to Milton Steinberg at the center. I missed the philosophic presentation, but somebody, I presume there was some Hicks in the conversation, if the title was correct. I don't know if Nadav or Vered mentioned the importance of the American philosopher Henry Nelson Wyman. Henry Nelson Wyman is significantly close to Kaplan, especially in his evaluation of the importance of the creative process as a religious endeavor. So this is fascinating. It opens many doors. And a discussion of both Hicks and Wyman is in Harold Schulweiss's book, Evil and the Morality of God. Another book worth exploring. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rabbi Sasso, for those comments. Appreciated. And I see that Jane has her hand raised. Jane, a comment or a question?
Yes, thank you. No, just a comment. I mean, this was amazing, and I will go back and try and assimilate more. But I want to thank Vered for the distinction between epistemological and ontological realism. I mean, that is such a valuable way to go forth when in discussion of God and godliness with folks who say, I don't believe in this. So it's a very powerful distinction, and I should have gotten that from my philosophy, and I really appreciate it. Thank you both. Take care.
Anyone else interested in putting a question to Vered or Nadav, or commenting about where their thoughts and provocations have taken you? I did see that there was a note by someone who is, I think, new to the Kaplan Center, hasn't been in our webinar before. I believe that's Bela. And you're coming to us from your studies in philosophy, I believe, from your note. Perhaps you want to share a little about that as well.
You speak about me, maybe? Okay, so my name is Bela Inesh. I'm from Israel. Right now, I am here in postdoc in University of Minnesota. I finished my PhD in 2022 in Tel Aviv University. In this semester, I try to focus in new project about Judaism and American Judaism, especially about heritage, language, identity, but especially after the event of October 7. And when I met a rabbi from Temple, Israel, and I told him about my project, he told me about Kaplan, and he gave me this book. And I tried to read, but as you understand, my English is not very fluent, very good to understand this book. So when I see this lecture, I said, wow, it's exactly what I need. And I try to understand. I am starting to understand who is Kaplan, what was his believing and his faith, just for motivation to understand about Judaism in general. And it was very, very good today to heard Vered and Nadav.
Well,
I just start, so I want to learn more, and I want to say thank you for this event.
well, keep joining us. Two sidebars. One is that Deborah Shine and me, Jeffrey Shine, we live here in Minneapolis, so we should meet sometime. And you should come to Mayim Rabim, the Reconstructing Judaism Shul. It'd be lovely to see you, and maybe you can put your email in the chat, and
Yes.
I'll do the same. But the second thing is that the timing of this is really wonderful, because for people who immerse themselves in Kaplan, we know that Judaism as a civilization can be a tough haul, but God always sends a creative solution before the plague hits us. The creative solution here, perhaps, is to go to the Kaplan Center website. Carol Kapper was a participant, and go to the Ira Eisenstein portal, where you will see Ira Eisenstein's creative Judaism and what we mean by religion, which we call seeing Kaplan through Eisenstein's eyes, and is an easier read, but still a very rich opportunity. So we invite you to do that. Sharon is good enough to put up our website address. Okay. Anyone else? Carol, and then Mel. Carol, please. You need to unmute, Carol. Or we need to learn to read lips, one of the two. Okay, I'm going to call on Mel, and then Carol, hopefully you can get unmuted.
Yeah.
Oh, now you are. Okay, go ahead, Carol, and then we'll get back
All
to
right,
Mel.
I really, I read the article last night, so I had some help in terminology, and I did really appreciate the seminar. I mean, if we're looking at as Kaplan as a realist, I'm still having difficulty with this idea of salvation as it manifests not through a personal God, not through a Calvinistic system. I mean, what is salvation, and how does that function with Kaplan's conception of the divine?
Vered or Nadav, you want to take that on?
Do we answer? I'll make a short one. And I think, like many other topics that we have been discussing, it depends on which book and which time frame you catch Kaplan in. And I think that was part of the things that bothered him all through his career: how to balance between particular and universal, how to keep a non-discussed God but still offer people a salvation. So I can focus on the specific solution that he gives in the text that I spoke about, and that says that he was very prudent to say that it's not old-fashioned salvation in the sense of Tchiat HaMetim, the dead actually, rising from the dead and living a physical perfection in some kind of an Eden, but more of accepting the world as it is, and then finding your way and your peace and your cause and your assignment in it. So it's a very different type of salvation that he's offering, sometimes not very satisfying for anyone who was educated within the Judeo-Christian of the sense of salvation as, the life after and the Messiah and kingdom come and so on. But I think he was very persistent as part of his project, obscure as it is sometimes, to build a very consistent cosmos in which everything happens here in this life, in this universe, including salvation. And then the big challenge is, how do you make sense? And because you need salvation, otherwise there is no human purpose. He agrees with Hick on this, even though he never read Hick. But it has to be in this life. And he says clearly that it's a very hard thing to achieve. But if you set your mind to it, you can be on the salvational road. And that's a lot. You might not reach the salvation that you've been told about in kindergarten, but that was part of his revolutionary project to reinterpret everything. And to say he was not shy. He was not afraid to touch on any topic, from God to salvation and so on. So Nadav, if you would like to add or comment.
Yes, I agree. I think part of the tragedy in Israel, at least, is that people equate salvation with otherworldliness, and particularly with apocalypse, which created the awkward idea that salvation at a collective level is connected to war in some important sense. But Kaplan thought really the opposite. He was Maimonidean, as you said, Vered on that, in thinking that the powers, the divine powers embedded in the cosmos that lead toward salvation, again, it's the personal and collective level, are in the here and now. They're waiting to our response, and they are by no means agents of chaos, but of cosmos. Cosmos, as you said, there are different renderings of the idea of soteriologies. There are a few articles on that about Kaplan, but I think this particular emphasis on the here and now, but in a patient manner, not Mashiach Achshav, and perhaps not Shalom Achshav in the non-patient manner, because serious processes demand patience, but they may happen in this world, as you said, as it was said before. It's a question of meliorism, right? It was Dennis, Rabbi Dennis, that said about Kaplan's meliorism, which is, or am I mistaken, but meliorism is, no, you talked about Kaplan's optimism, but I think he was more a meliorist, right? Because according to William James, meliorism is a middle road between pessimism, think of Schopenhauer, and optimism. And Kaplan was somewhere between meliorism and optimism, but I think in the context of salvation and redemption, his conception of redemption was this word, and I think it is in accordance with the early biblical ideas of messianism, right? There's no olam haba in the Tanakh, almost.
Yes.
We had a comment in the chat box from Lainey that I thought was interesting. Would you like to share that with us, Lainey?
Sure. In Martin Luther King's famous speech, he talks about the arc of justice, that that it doesn't happen immediately, but that the world tends toward that. And every time, I mean, I grew up hearing Kaplan, and I think that was what he meant, was that not that there was some sort of determinism to it, but that if you pull back and you look at history and you look at what's going on, there's a movement in that direction. And he called that movement salvation. One more thing, he and I had a conversation once about Zionism, and he said that he thought that anybody who used a historical or biblical basis for our claim to Israel was totally mistaken. That was not a realistic basis. That the realistic basis was based on law, international law, and the pragmatic development. So, for whatever.
Thank you, Lainey. Any other comments before we draw to a close? Mel?
I want to say about Vered's first statement about Kaplan and philosophy, which Nadav also picked up. I think Kaplan is on his way to being a philosopher, but he doesn't quite make it. But he is in the process. He himself is a process, I would say. The other thing I want to say is about Kaplan's notion of salvation. In the 1950s, he was looking for a Hebrew term, and he said, shalom is what we mean by salvation. He quoted from the Musaf of the Regalim, where it says about God, Ata shalom v'shimcha shalom. Ata shalom v'shimcha shalom. That your name is peace and you are peace. And the word shlemut is, of course, related. So we might say that salvation is shalom when it recurs to the society, and shlemut, or perfection. In other words, to be redeemed in a certain sense is to work towards perfection. The other thing that I might say is, I think, Nadav, you have written a great deal about Kaplan's pragmatism, and I think everybody sees Kaplan as a pragmatist, but I think his pragmatism was very superficial, in the sense that pragmatism is a very open kind of a system, an open kind of an epistemology. I have been reading Santayana on William James, and he is critical of James, who was his teacher, and he says James couldn't make up his mind, and that's And that's why he believed in pragmatism. And then I also read Richard Rorty and the extreme to which pragmatism can lead. He wrote an essay which is called Polytheism. Anyway, in which he advocates, he's a follower of Dewey, and he advocates that poetry can be substituted for religion. Now, I don't believe that, but this is the extreme to which pragmatism can lead, and I'm not sure Kaplan was ready to accept the implications of his belief in pragmatic methodology.
In over the summer, I had a short dialogue with David Ellenson about Kaplan and pragmatism. And out of that dialogue came back an important distinction that pragmatism has more than one face. And within the dialogue of pragmatism, there's a distinction between utilitarianism, John Stuart Mill, where anything goes if it produces more happiness for the society and individual, and rule utilitarianism, which puts up fences, that there are certain things you can't do because society can't live without restraints and fences. And my professor of philosophy at University of California, Santa Barbara used to say that he's a believer in the higher pragmatism that he finds echoed in James and Dewey, but not the lower pragmatism that comes across rather crassly in William James, the cash value. That's, anything goes if it produces more of some other good. Anyway, I do want to take a moment and thank especially Vered and Nadav for this very rich dialogue. You've stretched our minds. Actually, it dates back to an exchange I had with Vered when I first met her, and we were asking her to put something up on the Kaplan Center website and thinking about this, and we disagreed. We had a machloket, and Vered said, well, these people can stretch, well, they don't immediately do philosophy, but we can challenge them. That's a good thing. And I said, well, they can, but I'm not sure you'll find the right audience. And Vered, I'm publicly acknowledging that you were right. I think people did stretch and find this very useful. So thank you for pushing us there. Want to thank, as always, Jane Susswine, our president, for starting us off, and Sheridan, our administrator, for serving as our Zoom gabbai. Thank you to everyone who participated. Eric Kaplan, who actually our other vice president and academic advisor for the Kaplan Center, who helped me see the way in which this webinar could unfold when we were talking about it last year at this time. So thanks to everyone. And remember, you've been released through the Megillah of Roger Goodell. You don't have to go watch the Super Bowl now, but you can if you want. And thank you for all the richness of this inquiry. Okay, and Vered, if you could stay on for just a few minutes, I'd appreciate that.
תודה נדב, היה תענוג, אני מקווה שנדבר
Thank you,
בקרוב.
Jeff. Thank you all.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye.
Nice to meet you.
Bye, Mel. It was a pleasure seeing you,
Thanks.
as always.
Thank you. Bye.
Daniel Musher. Hi, Daniel.
Bye.
Roberta Tanti. Goodbye. Nice to see your face.
Thank you. You too.
Okay. Daniel, thanks for joining us. Okay, you'll see that this is uploaded, right, Sheridan? You always do.
Yep, and I can go. Just want to make sure.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, you can go.
Bye. Thank you so much for all your help, Sheridan.
Yes, and do you want to stop the recording, Jeffrey, or should we just stop?
I think you can. This
Okay.
next thing does
All right.
not need to be on the record.